In the new book, The Cinema of Tarkovsky, Labyrinths of Space and Time, Stanford Slavic Studies professor Nariman Skakov attempts to unearth some of the embedded meaning in the metaphysical films of Andrei Tarkovsky. Professor Skakov, welcome.
Hi.
So tell us about the films of Tarkovsky. He was working, in the earlier part of the 20th century. And what was he trying to do with his films and his style? This was very different from what you'd see in Hollywood, right?
The first thing we should mention is that Tarkovsky was a Soviet filmmaker. He made lots of films abroad, but he was profoundly kind of a Soviet filmmaker who worked for the Soviet state, who was financed by the Soviet state, who made very anti-Soviet films. So it's the first thing which is quite puzzling is how he managed to make those films within the Soviet system.
And what was it that was un-Soviet about his films?
The narrative threads were loose. They were very long. The general public considered them to be boring. And he invented some of the key filming devices, like long take, for instance. He really perfected it. And it is a very challenging for an impatient viewer to endure Tarkovsky's long take.
He described it as sculpting in time. Can you tell us about that? What does sculpting in time mean?
Sculpting in time is a term he coined and he put forward as his major theoretical paradigm. Basically, he said that the process of filmmaking is sculpting in time. The way we perceive time, the duration in time is crucial, and in cinema it's the only art form which delivers this experience of time to us. So he claimed that for a filmmaker, the main task is to sculpt a piece of art by temporal means.
And so what did you try to do looking at that, in that guise of looking at the time, looking at his films? What were you able to conclude based upon your examination of his works?
Yeah, basically the thing I found, I always found this term, because Tarkovsky definitely wanted to suppress the notion of space, and he claimed that cinema is temporal art. But the term itself, sculpting in time, is purely spatial. I mean, sculpture is the most spatial form of art. So why did he need this latent presence of space to promote his aesthetic ideas? So I found it quite puzzling. And then I just realized that there is this discrepancy in Tarkovsky's aesthetics. I mean, space is always important. I mean, in his films, all these temporal shifts, they take place by means of space. And then when I looked, and of course, his long take is the major aesthetic device which reveals the progression of time. You always see dreams or hallucinations or something which takes you from this current reality, from this present space and time to another imagined time.
What movies today draw from the work of Tarkovsky in the past?
There are quite a few filmmakers. I mean, Lars von Trier dedicated his film Antichrist, which I think is spectacular, to Tarkovsky. Though he's not really influenced by Tarkovsky, he's not his pupil or student, but he definitely admired him. So visually, I thought his influence is huge, absolutely, in visual arts.
But for someone today, you think about the quick soundbite, the quick editing today. Would it be very hard for someone today to watch a Tarkovsky film who's not used to?
I think for a generation who is really into iPhone applications, iPad, streaming shorter clips. Of course, it is difficult to endure 3-hour, 30-minute film, and especially with Tarkovsky long takes. I mean, some of them they take 11 minutes, no cuts, for instance. I mean, it is difficult to endure in time. But once you get used to this pace, you will start noticing amazing details. And I mean, I've noticed so many details, like a reflection of a camera in the button of a protagonist in Stalker, or little tiny hints he scatters in Sacrifice or in Solaris, for instance. I mean, there are so many beautiful tiny details which you start get noticing. Or in Mirror, for instance, there is a reflection of Tarkovsky actually in the wardrobe, which takes place for less than a second, and you can notice if you're attentive.
So it almost forces us to watch film differently, to be really searching in the frame, searching for clues, looking for deeper meaning rather than having everything wash over you so quickly.
Definitely, and I think it's a nice counterbalance for this kind of phase of life we face now. I think it's a really great exercise. There are really thick novels as well, which current students find them hard to read, like War and Peace or something like Joseph and His Brothers by Thomas Mann. These kind of novels tend to be a huge task for contemporary students to read them. So I think that Tarkovsky's films, they're good. Aesthetically, they're amazing. They kind of great artistic statements, but also they're kind of good exercises, I think, for our minds, for our kind of aesthetic perception.
You mentioned Solaris, which I think many people will know either from the original or the remake. What did that film really do for him in terms of elevating him? He was already very well known, but can you tell us about that film in particular and what you appreciated and enjoyed about that?
And to be honest, I don't really appreciate it. I think it's the weakest film in Tarkovsky's oeuvre. I love the way it's filmed. It's beautifully, beautifully, beautifully filmed. But the problem is that he tried to tackle a genre which was kind of essentially alien, the genre of science fiction. Tarkovsky was about the mundane world, as we know, the world of our memories, of our hallucinations, but it's not a fantastic world. So that's why he kind of damaged the novel by Stanisław Lem, and Lem himself was really, really kind of aggravated by the fact that Tarkovsky kind of distorted. He famously said that he didn't adapt my novel, but he staged Crime and Punishment, because half of the action takes place on the Earth, actually, in Solaris, and which is not a kind of case in the novel. So it is a kind of strange film, and Tarkovsky had a kind of quite an uneasy relationship with this film. But nevertheless, there are kind of amazing moments. There is a kind of silent music adaptation of one of his father's poems in the film with Bonfire, with kind of memories, when Chris shows this kind of video, which he kind of shot on Earth to Harry. This was actually kind of a silent muted adaptation of his father's poem. So there are kind of really interesting elements, and it's beautifully, beautifully shot.
So if Solaris is one of his weaker films, which one would you say really stands out?
Mira is considered to be his greatest achievement. It has kind of this huge impact. I don't know, Persona by Bergman or Last Year in Marienbad by René. It's considered to be one of the greatest films made in the 20th century. It's extremely experimental in terms of narrative, in terms of filmmaking. It's impeccable. It's his probably hardest film, but at the same time, I think it's just an impeccable piece of filmmaking.
So what can we learn from Tarkovsky by studying him today, and what can filmmakers really glean from his techniques and his willingness to try something different?
I spent with Tarkovsky and his films for about 7 years, and the main conclusion I made actually is that Tarkovsky's views himself, he was actually quite a kind of intolerant, kind of right-wing leaning kind of person, and he had a kind of quite a very clear vision how the world should work. He had this conviction that he knows how everything should be. So he had this kind of very inflexible worldview, but at the same time, if you look at his films, his characters, they always fail to achieve their goal. They either die or lose their mind, or they hallucinate. They always fail to achieve their goal. So this kind of totality, which he tries to deliver, always ends up in a dead end. Nothing really solidifies. And because, in my opinion, my interpretation is that Tarkovsky was a kind of much more he was an amazing artist, and his kind of rather limited worldview, personal this spiritual right-wing Russian soul discourse was actually overwhelmed by his talent. So that's why in his films, actually, this totality is never achieved.
So there's a tragedy there.
Yeah, you can say that. I think all art is inherently tragic. Tragedy is the first form of art, I guess. I think it's interesting. It's boring to watch happy end kind of type of films because you know how they will end. And if you for the first time you experience, can you predict how Mira would end? If you watch it for the first time, no way. It's just impossible. And still people can't even figure out how it ends after watching the film. So I think it's just a different practice of filmmaking, of making images.
Earlier you talked about Tarkovsky being kind of a curmudgeon. I wanted to know, did he care about whether or not people got the point of what he was trying to say in his movies?
No. He had a very strong opinion about his films. The thing is, again, he was kind of contradicting himself because he hated when people would ask him, like, so what does this wind in mirror mean? He said that it's just wind. When you kind of experience wind in your childhood, you go like, you are in an open field and there is wind. Does this wind mean anything? It's just a physical phenomenon. And he was really irritated by this kind of spiritual readings that wind signifies some kind of holy ghost manifesting itself in this open field or something like that. And I think that that's why he was kind of contradicting himself, because he always had like a very strong vision of his films, how they should be interpreted. But at the same time, he kind of didn't like those reductive kind of readings.
You mentioned some people who have taken on his mantle, but is there a movie you think today that Tarkovsky would really like?
That's a good question. I mean, he definitely knew that he was a great artist. So he was really harsh, actually. He had arguments with Bergman, with Antonioni at some stages. So, yeah, for me, it's difficult. I mean, he was definitely, there are notes when he was really fascinated by Sakurov's first film, The Lonely Voice of Man. And he said that there is like a kind of passage sequence he wished he had filmed. It was spectacular, this kind of scene in a kind of this market shot in black and white. But to me, actually, the filmmaker who pushes those boundaries further in a kind of different register is David Lynch, the California native. Ironically, though, he's got this kind of new dimension which Tarkovsky really lacked, is a sense of humor, irony, completely absent in Tarkovsky. And Lynch, who pushes this multiplicity of worlds visually, he's striking, spectacular. So to me, it's actually David Lynch, who is not a kind of Tarkovsky disciple, but he definitely pushes this discourse further.
Well, it's interesting to see, where the conversation goes and how one change in genre kind of builds on another. And looking back at Tarkovsky and his contributions, I think, is something that is interesting for people who are interested in film and for people who want to see how art forms evolve. Well, Thank you so much. That is Nariman Skakov. His new book is called The Cinema of Tarkovsky, Labyrinths of Space and Time. Nariman Skakov is a Stanford professor in Slavic Studies. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rob.